So I originally wrote this talk to present in Berkeley because somebody asked me to talk about food and biosemiotics, and I happen to be an organic farmer, so I thought, well, okay, I'll somehow talk about that. And but it didn't last very long, and I quickly got on the idea of free range humans instead of free range chickens, and I started applying this to the larger world and talking about self-organization. So we definitely want a society, when we're thinking about how we can best organize our society, we want a society where people have the freedom and the opportunity to think for themselves, to act purposefully, to make choices. We also want people to be in a position to be able to adapt and to evolve. This is Fredo. He's actually no longer with us. He was invited to dinner. As a farmer, I provide enclosures for my animals to keep them safe from other predators. We have to cut hay to give them food in the wintertime, otherwise they'd have to migrate. But basically they take care of themselves, and I try to make it easy for them to take care of themselves. And I don't want to work very hard either. I want to work, benefit off nature, not try to control it. Individuals are not purposeful beings unless they have to fend for themselves. Free-range chickens figure out that they should follow the cows or the sheep around because they scare up insects and they're able to catch them. I could talk all day about my chickens, how smart they are. Tool use, altruism, cooperation, planning ahead. They're very creative and smart. And you don't have to feed free-range chickens in the summertime. They, find berries, and the grasses go to seed. That's the best way to raise animals together. Use them together. So how do we create the best social and economic systems? Obviously, systems should provide what biosemioticians call enabling constraints. Constraints that help the animals fend for themselves. Obviously, these chickens are not being enabled to fend for themselves. And as people, what we need is a government that allows us and expects us to be free-range humans. In a natural ecosystem, the enabling constraints would be the more or less permanent network of animals, plants, and other organisms that are inherited every generation, and this network emerges through the interaction of the different parts of the network. And the networks are created by their own interactions, and they help create and sustain their own networks. No matter what sort of social or political system we try to put into place, whether it's democracy, communism, socialism, free market, capitalism, or even anarchy, there's a tendency for power to concentrate over time. And this is partly due to self-organization. It's not always natural selection. It's not always the most fit who rise to the top. The rich just get richer and the poor just get poorer. And mostly this has to do with arbitrary sign action. Fitness in human society is not like it is in nature. Power and fitness is based on abstract ideas. I won't get into that too much, but you can imagine what I mean there. So society, a healthy society should provide the constraints that enable freedom. Some of the constraints that we have are language. Language provides the rules and the grammar and the definitions and the sort of reliable communication system. Roads, to get from point A to point B, if you build a road, you're not able to go as the crow flies anymore. You're constrained to go in this particular direction but it's helpful and efficient. Enabling Constraint is an online community where people are brought together in the same place and sort of forced to interact with each other. Our messages aren't just going out into the world and, we have difficulty finding each other. This constraint that Pile has put together is helping us communicate. And I'm going to make a jump now. I hope you'll go with me. It's okay, that slide. I'm going to stop too and get some comments before I go on with my talk too, because I want to hear from you a little bit. But let me make a leap. I'm going to talk about the origin of life. The origin of life theories now, most of them work with, first of all, some sort of constraint that brings the, say, precursors of RNA, DNA together, kind of pressure, some sort of enclosure, something that brings them together so that they have a higher probability of interacting, bumping into each other, self-organizing, and then forming some sort of autocatalytic reaction that helps them self-maintain and self-create. So what I want to sort of focus on or bring your attention to is this idea of enabling constraints. And this is also, I've mentioned already that biosemiotics depends on things being near enough together that they can become associated with each other. The enabling constraint term comes from Terence Deacon, if any of you are familiar with that. And he has this visual model that he constructs where the enabling constraint is some sort of tubule that self-organizes and allows reactions to go on. The highly unlikely chemical reactions are constrained within this tube. So it's highly unlikely that all these chemicals would have come together, so the tubule helps keep them together. But the reaction inside that tube is, flowing to the lowest energy state. And any biological organism is just this collection of little enclosures that help these rather unlikely chemical reactions occur. So life is always taking advantage of entropy and by creating these structures that can take advantage of that flow. This would be an illustration of what a healthy political system might look like. And you have separate sustainable ecosystems, people or groups of animals who create their own rules of engagement for each other by their interactions, their local reciprocity. Then the separate ecosystems interact with each other by benefiting off each other's waste and byproducts. And this contrasts the hierarchical system where the people at the top benefit off the work of the bottom, and the people at the top are just providing basically enclosures, cages, and police state or military state. So, and I like the idea of using the recycle icon to show the reciprocity. Does anybody know this symbol? Does that ring a bell with anyone? This is from Thomas Pynchon's novel, The Crying of Lot 49. I just mention it because not many people have interpreted that novel. They haven't realized that it's about semiotics and self-organization. It's about a leaderless revolution. There's a character in there who's based on C.S. Peirce, the semiotician that biosemioticians always refer to. And there's this alternative communication system that sort of basically recycles waste. And there's, so I just want to point out that literary people are way ahead of scientists sometimes in thinking about these sort of things. Thomas Pynchon was interested in self-organizing slime molds before it was popular. So what would make a a government, a good government. As I already mentioned, a leaderless revolution like anarchy quickly becomes hierarchical due to the constraints that emerge during self-organization. So government should be like permaculture farmers, basically creating enabling constraints. One of those would be a national currency. And I have greenbacks here instead of the US dollar. And I won't go into monetary policy, but we can come back and talk about why I chose fiat currency, greenback instead. Roads, transportation lines, energy lines, communication lines, a public user-controlled internet. Government should provide school buildings and equipment, hospital buildings, but not run them. Governments should provide an inherited system of laws, border enclosures. Government should not try to micromanage the behaviors within these enclosures. The professionals and the people interacting within these constraints should create and maintain the constraints themselves. And the rules for instance, the rules governing medical practice should be created by the interaction of the practice and the practices of the doctors and the patients, not by the politicians or the bureaucrats. I think a lot of these models of decentralization come out of the complex systems view of how organizations naturally develop and probably how they should develop, so that they're, the most efficient and serve more people fairly, mm-hmm. or more equitable. So policy and the decision making would include the academy, research institutions, conventions, laws, conventional ways of doing things, traditional medicine, and you may run into trouble because sometimes some of these institutions are conservative, and the new research, wants to, challenge some of the authority of the experts, and that's fine. That's the kind of tension that we need and expect in any society. But the people that I would take out of this are the politicians and the taxpayers. Because politicians have political reasons for promoting various medically relevant laws, and taxpayers say, I don't want to pay for something that I don't support. I don't want that kind of medical treatment. And so, this is going off topic a little bit, but I think the solution to that is a new monetary policy where dollars are created by the government by fiat, like greenbacks, and used directly to build the infrastructure, not to provide the services, but just to build the enclosures where medical treatment can be carried on, to build the hospitals. And so taxpayers aren't actually paying for any of the services, and taxes aren't being collected to build the hospitals. It's just the hospitals are being built with fiat money, and the value of the dollar is actually backed by the value of the assets that have been created. A wealthy nation has public hospitals that are well equipped. And so, if you handle things that way, you take the taxpayer out of the equation. So the taxpayer can't say, well, I don't support that kind of procedure. But I don't want to get too much. Monetary policy is a very interesting subject, and I think it might be a solution to taking out those players in this system who really aren't thinking about the health and of the people involved, the patients and the doctor. They have other issues that they're promoting. So I would like to take those people out of the equation if possible. So nature has seen fit to make it so that given constraints, life will self-organize, and the body is, I've already kind of got into this already, The body is a physical enclosure where, thanks to inherited gene templates, the right kinds of chemicals are produced, triggering reactions that occur in basically the right order and at the right time through sign action. And organisms are self-assembling and self-maintaining. This should be the unattainable ideal for agricultural, economic, political, and social systems too. Ideally, subsystems and systems would benefit off each other's byproducts, excess and waste. And these interactions should create the structural constraints that keep them in a relationship. When people talk about social models of organization, you often see something like this. Social systems need distributed intelligence, decentralized command and control. There's been a lot of work done in this area as applied complexity sciences, but something is missing from the complex system approach, and that something is biosemiotics, the theory of signs and interpretation. With the traditional hierarchical model, it's more or less transparent who's wielding the power. In a decentralized network, it can become dominated by a few people who have control of money, technology, or laws. And a decentralized network can easily develop a hierarchical structure that's hidden from the participants. And the big octopus might be someone like Amazon or Google or Facebook or something, or the central bank, or so the decentralized system becomes centralized very quickly, and that's partly due to self-organization, and that's partly due to the fact that our notions of value are very abstract and not regulated by the environment. The internet was going to bring global peace through free trade and open communication, but it has created a too homogeneous planet, tending toward equilibrium. Value is quantified and redistributed along the network. The open network doesn't have enough enclosures created by different groups, like this one. Independent niches more or less isolated from the global effects. Today, there are very few independent scholars, artists, musicians, professionals, artisans, farmers, and this kills the kind of local reciprocity and mutually beneficial relationships which lead to enabling constraints and semiotic freedom. The very idea of agency is left out of the complex systems network model, in which the nodes are just pass-through points for the diffusion of information. The nodes are pure automatons. What complex systems approaches are missing is the theory of the sign, the role of interpretation, which is, I think, what allows the multiple interacting adaptable constraints to emerge. The users of the network should be changing the network as they use it in creative ways. AI uses statistical averaging to change the network. When I was at SFI, Santa Fe Institute, it was said that effectual factors in nonlinear systems is what allows it to self-organize and become more complex. So of course, I kept asking, what do you mean by effectual factors? So that led me into studying biosemiotics, and I think that biosemiotics provides some of the answers to that question: what are effectual factors? What distinguishes non-living systems, simple systems, non-complex systems, from living organisms is the latter's use of signs and chemical signals. They use things, signs, as a means to an end, survival or self-maintenance. Creativity, which is the essence of being alive, is the reinterpretation of a means to an end for use toward a different end. I hope that's not too abstract, but we can talk more about that. So what I've learned from my chickens and from biosemiotics, that's helped me come up with some very general principles for creative living systems. Heterarchy, not hierarchy. Every self-organized system begins with constraints, an enclosure, a limited communication network, a niche, a farm, a flock, institutions, language, conventions, constitutions, basic laws, semi-porous national or regional boundaries. Within these constraints, the individuals do not need a law governing every exchange or action because the regularizing effect of these constraints, which they all have in common, is enough to provide the reliable rule-governed behavior that is somewhat predictable and yet open to novelty. That's being a bit idealistic, but still. Individuals must pursue their own purposes, be somewhat responsible for their own survival. If members of a group depart from the regular constraints, usually by reinterpreting them, they will either make the group more diverse, adaptable, and robust, or form a separate group with a different dynamic. Maintaining diversity and having separate niches or groups keeps the world from becoming too homogeneous. Signals can't travel across systems with different constraints, and that's important. We need to tolerate differences, even if we don't agree with people. That's why free speech is so important. We're getting a lot of censorship lately. Separate interacting niches both keep one another alive and constrain each other's growth. I can't stress this enough. Diversity is very important, and we don't want everybody thinking the same thing, even if our ideas seem to be better than other people's. In terms of resources, ideally niche to niche interactions should be limited such that they benefit off each other's byproducts, excess and waste. We don't want to bleed your neighbors dry. We must allow for mistakes. Top-down command and control systems are designed to eliminate error. Massively interconnected distributed systems average away errors and novelties. Complex systems tend to, through selection, select a novelty and help it spread or grow. People must have semiotic freedom with enabling constraints to be robust and adaptable. And I'll leave you with one image, ending my talk. Due largely to its for-profit prison system, the US has 25% of the world's prison population, even though it only has about 5% of the world's population. And that's my talk. So now we get to spend the rest of our time just discussing things.